In 1851, a family portrait captured 12 people posing before a grand mansion in rural Louisiana. The image appeared to represent the prosperity of a respected family, the plantation master, his wife, and their children. But there was a secret buried within that carefully arranged composition, a secret that only one person knew completely: the enslaved midwife who had brought each of those children into the world. For decades, that photograph remained in family archives, passed down through generations as a symbol of heritage and tradition. But in 2019, when descendants began researching their family tree through DNA testing, they discovered impossible connections. Lines that should never cross intertwined in disturbing ways. The truth began to emerge from letters stored in dusty trunks, altered birth records, and a coded diary written by the midwife herself, a woman named Dina, whose memory had been erased from official records but not from history. What did that photograph really show? Which children were legitimate offspring and which were the product of systematic violence masked as the natural order of plantation life? The answer lay buried in carefully maintained silences, in complicity that crossed generations, and in a system designed to erase evidence while perpetuating crimes. This is the story of how a single image contained multiple truths, and how Dina's secret survived more than 160 years to finally be revealed. A story about memory, denial, and the belated courage to confront the past. Chapter 1. The impossible photograph 174 years ago, on an isolated plantation in rural Louisiana. A photograph was taken that would become evidence of one of the most disturbing secrets of American slavery. 12 people posed before the great white mansion: the plantation master, his wife, and 10 children of varying ages. The composition seemed perfect, the image of a prosperous and respected family. But there was something deeply wrong with that photograph, something only one woman knew for certain, and she was not in the picture. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Westfield Plantation, as it was known, stretched across more than 2,000 acres along the Mississippi River. In 1851, when the photograph was taken, the property housed approximately 180 enslaved people and produced cotton for export. The plantation master, Jonathan Westfield, was considered a shrewd businessman and a respected member of the local community. His wife, Catherine, came from a traditional Charleston family and had brought her own dowry of enslaved people into the marriage. The photograph was commissioned as a symbol of prosperity. Photographs were expensive in 1851, and very few plantations could afford the cost of hiring a traveling photographer. The daguerreotype took almost an hour to prepare and expose. Throughout that time, the 12 people remained motionless, frozen in a pose meant to represent family harmony. But there are disturbing details in that composition. 3 of the children have facial features noticeably different from the others. Their skin tones are ambiguous in the black and white image, their features not fully matching either the master or the mistress. And there is something in Catherine Westfield's eyes, an expression modern historians describe as frozen resignation or bitter knowledge. The midwife Dina does not appear in the photograph. She would never appear in any official family records. But she was the one who brought each of those 10 children into the world. She was the one who knew each birth, each date, each circumstance. And she was the one who began keeping a secret diary, not in English, but in a code based on symbols and words from African languages she had learned from her own mother. In 1851, Dina was approximately 45 years old. She had been purchased by the Westfield family when she was only 16, specifically for her experience in childbirth. Over nearly 3 decades, she had attended more than 200 births on the plantation and neighboring properties. She knew secrets no other living person knew, and she knew that some of those secrets could destroy entire families if revealed. Dina's diary, discovered only in 2019 inside a false wall in an old slave cabin, contains meticulous records, conception dates, birth dates, and coded marks beside certain names. Marks that, when deciphered, revealed a devastating truth about the real composition of that family in the photograph. Of the 10 children listed as legitimate descendants of Jonathan and Catherine Westfield, at least 4 were not Catherine's children. They were children of enslaved women on the plantation, born from systematic violence, and then incorporated into the official family through silent arrangements and falsified documentation. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Silence. Westfield Plantation operated under a carefully constructed system of appearances and secrets. Jonathan Westfield kept meticulous records of his properties. Every bale of cotton, every farming tool, every enslaved person was documented in voluminous ledgers. But there were deliberate gaps in these records, absences that would only become visible when examined decades later. Catherine Westfield had given birth to only 3 children biologically. Her first delivery in 1837 nearly killed her. Dina spent 2 days and 2 nights trying to save both mother and child. The baby, a boy named William, survived. Catherine survived as well, but with complications that would make future births extremely dangerous. A doctor from New Orleans, discreetly summoned to the plantation, advised that she should not have more children. But Jonathan Westfield wanted heirs. He came from a large family and believed a successful plantation needed many children to ensure continuity and expansion. The absence of children would be seen as weakness, as failure, and in a slaveholding society where power and prestige were measured in terms of property and lineage, the appearance of a large family was essential. That was when what Dina's records call the arrangement began. Catherine had 2 more children, Margaret in 1839 and Thomas in 1842, both extremely difficult births that left her health permanently compromised. After Thomas's birth, the same New Orleans doctor declared that another delivery could kill her. Catherine was only 28 years old. During the following 9 years, between 1842 and 1851, 7 additional children were incorporated into the Westfield family. Officially, all were listed as children of Jonathan and Catherine. But Dina's records tell a different story. Each of these children was born to enslaved mothers, women who had no choice, no voice, no way to protect their own children. The system worked through layers of complicity. When an enslaved woman became pregnant by Jonathan Westfield, she was discreetly transferred to domestic work inside the main house. Dina was called to attend the birth in an isolated room. Catherine remained in her quarters, simulating a pregnancy that never existed through strategically adjusted clothing and calculated social isolation. When the child was born, if their appearance was ambiguous enough, skin light enough, European features sufficient, they were presented as legitimate Westfield offspring. The biological mother was then sent to work in distant parts of the plantation or sold to neighboring properties through discreet arrangements. The child was raised inside the main house, educated as white, and would eventually inherit property and status. Baptismal documents were falsified. Birth records were altered. The New Orleans doctor, who visited the plantation only occasionally, signed certificates without asking questions. Local priests accepted information provided by the family without question. And the surrounding community, neighboring plantation owners, local merchants, county authorities, maintained complicit silence because many of them operated under similar arrangements. Catherine Westfield knew. She knew about each child who was not biologically hers. She knew about the enslaved women whose motherhood was stolen, and she carried this knowledge as a crushing weight that manifested in private letters discovered more than 150 years later. In a letter to her sister in Charleston dated 1848, Catherine wrote, "There are lies we live daily, and truths that can never be told. My house is full of both." But no one felt the weight of this system more than Dina. She was forced to participate in perpetuating the lie. She brought the children into the world, cut their umbilical cords, and then handed them over to a life built on the denial of their true mothers. She saw the biological mothers suffering in silence, watching their children grow as strangers, never able to claim them. And so, Dina began to write. In her coded diary, she recorded not just dates and names, but also details only she knew: birthmarks, complications in delivery, undeniable facial resemblances. She was creating evidence that could someday reveal the truth. Chapter 3. The Children of the Lie. In 1851, when the photograph was taken, the children in the image ranged from 2 to 14 years old. Each had an official origin story: baptismal records, signed certificates, carefully constructed family memories. But behind these official stories were much darker realities that Dina recorded in her diary with disturbing precision. William, the eldest son, was 14 in the photograph. He was undoubtedly the biological son of Jonathan and Catherine. His birth had nearly killed his mother, and his appearance left no doubt about his lineage. He was raised to eventually inherit the entire plantation, educated in management and business, prepared from an early age to perpetuate the system that sustained the family's wealth. Margaret, 12, and Thomas, 9, were equally Catherine's biological children. But the 7 remaining children, Caroline, Elizabeth, James, Robert, Sarah, Daniel, and little Emily, were all children of Jonathan Westfield with enslaved women on the plantation. Caroline, who was 8 in the photograph, was the daughter of a woman named Rachel. Dina recorded the birth in her diary with painful details. Rachel was only 17 when she was forced to become the object of Jonathan Westfield's attention. When she became pregnant, she was transferred to the main house under the pretext of being trained as a seamstress. Catherine simulated a pregnancy using cushions and loose dresses. The birth happened on a stormy night in January 1843, and Caroline was presented as a legitimate Westfield daughter. Rachel never saw her daughter up close again. She was transferred to work in the cotton fields in the most distant part of the plantation, where she remained until being sold to a property in Mississippi 2 years later. Caroline grew up never knowing who her real mother was. She was educated as a young white woman of means, learned piano and French, and would eventually marry the son of another plantation owner. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Elizabeth and James were twins born in 1844 to a woman named Mary. The twin birth was complicated, one of the most difficult Dina had ever attended. Mary almost died from blood loss. The babies were premature, fragile, and Dina spent weeks ensuring their survival. Jonathan Westfield decided to keep both children, presenting them as Catherine's, despite the obvious impossibility of Catherine having recently given birth. Mary was assigned to work in the plantation laundry, a building far from the main house. She could occasionally see her children from a distance, watch them playing in the garden, dressed in fine clothes she herself had washed and ironed. She never spoke to them. The pain of that enforced distance drove her to attempt escape in 1846. She was captured, publicly punished as a warning to others, and sold to a plantation in Alabama. Elizabeth and James never knew their mother existed. Robert, born in 1846, was the son of a woman named Hannah. Unlike the others, Hannah was a skilled cook who worked in the main house kitchen. Her proximity to the family made the situation even more torturous. After Robert's birth, she continued working in the house, preparing meals for the child she had born, watching him grow, never able to acknowledge their connection. Hannah's diary entries, discovered alongside Dina's, reveal a woman slowly breaking under the weight of enforced silence. Sarah, born in 1848, came from a woman named Esther, who had been brought to Westfield Plantation specifically for her light complexion. Jonathan Westfield had purchased her from a New Orleans market after seeing her. She was 19 years old. 6 months later, she was pregnant. The birth was unremarkable medically, but Dina recorded something unusual in her diary. Esther refused to look at the baby after delivery. She turned her face to the wall and would not speak for 3 days. Esther was kept on the plantation, but reassigned to field work in the most brutal conditions. Some historians believe this was intentional punishment for her emotional resistance. She died in 1852, officially from fever, though plantation records show she had stopped eating weeks before her death. Sarah grew up believing Catherine was her mother, and never learned the truth during her lifetime. Daniel, born in 1849, was the son of a woman named Chloe. Unlike the other mothers, Chloe had been enslaved on Westfield Plantation her entire life. She had grown up there, knew no other world. When Jonathan Westfield began forcing his attention on her, she was 16. She became pregnant almost immediately. The birth was straightforward, but Dina noted that Chloe sang during labor. Old songs in languages Dina recognized from her own mother, songs of sorrow and resistance. Chloe was not sold away. Instead, she was kept as a field hand, always visible but always distant. Jonathan Westfield's cruelty in this case was keeping her close enough to see Daniel, but never close enough to touch him. She would live another 40 years on that plantation, surviving long enough to see the end of slavery but never reunited with her son, who had been raised to believe he was white and who wanted nothing to do with former enslaved people after emancipation. And finally there was Emily, the youngest in the photograph, only 2 years old. She was the daughter of a woman named Judith, who had been enslaved at Westfield for only 6 months before becoming pregnant. The pregnancy was difficult, the birth dangerous. Dina worked for 12 hours to save both mother and child. When Emily was finally born, healthy and light-skinned enough to pass, Judith was immediately separated from her and sold to a plantation in Texas within 2 weeks. Judith never even learned her daughter's name. These were the children in the photograph, 7 of them raised as white, educated as heirs, given privileges and opportunities their mothers could never imagine. 7 children who grew up not knowing half their heritage, not knowing the women who bore them, not knowing the violence that had brought them into existence, and only Dina knew all their stories. Chapter 4. The Weight of Knowledge. Dina carried the burden of knowing what no one else was permitted to acknowledge. Every day she moved through the plantation seeing truths that others refused to see. She watched Caroline play with dolls in the main house garden while Rachel labored in distant fields. She saw Elizabeth and James receive tutoring in reading and arithmetic, while their mother Mary suffered in an Alabama plantation. She prepared medicinal teas for Sarah's childhood illnesses, while Esther's grave grew weeds in the slave cemetery. The weight of this knowledge manifested in Dina's body and spirit. Letters from a plantation neighbor, discovered in 2017, described Dina as having aged dramatically in her 40s, becoming quieter, more withdrawn. Where she had once been known for singing while she worked, she now moved in near silence. Her hands, which had brought hundreds of children into the world, began to shake. But Dina was not passive in her suffering. The diary she kept was an act of resistance, a refusal to let truth die completely. She wrote in a complex code that combined English words, African language terms she had learned from her mother and grandmother, and symbols she invented herself. The code was sophisticated enough that when the diary was finally discovered in 2019, it took a team of linguists, historians, and cryptographers nearly 18 months to fully decipher it. The diary reveals that Dina was part of a quiet network of enslaved women on the plantation who knew fragments of the truth and protected each other's sanity through shared knowledge. There was Aunt Bess, who worked in the main house and could observe the children up close. There was Ruth, who worked in the laundry alongside Mary before Mary was sold away, and who carried Mary's final messages. There was old Sarah, who tended the slave cemetery and knew which unnamed graves held women who had died from the trauma of having their children stolen. These women created a counter-narrative to the official family history. They passed down oral histories to their own children and grandchildren, preserving fragments of truth that would survive even when written records were destroyed. Their whispered conversations in the quarters at night, their coded songs in the fields, their knowing glances when certain children were mentioned. All of this was a form of testimony that official history tried to erase but could not completely silence. Dina also documented the toll this system took on Catherine Westfield. While Catherine was complicit in the arrangement, she was also trapped within it. Dina recorded instances where Catherine would retreat to her room for days, refusing to see anyone. She noted Catherine's increasing dependence on laudanum, a common opiate of the era. She described Catherine's nightmares, which could be heard throughout the house, and her occasional moments of what appeared to be dissociation during family gatherings. In one particularly revealing diary entry from 1849, Dina wrote, "Mistress Catherine held baby Emily today. Her hands shook. She whispered something I could not hear, then handed the child back quickly and left the room. I found her later in the garden, weeping. She knows the weight she carries. She knows the lie she lives, but she is trapped in it as surely as we are, though her chains are made of different material." This observation reveals Dina's complex understanding of power and complicity. She did not excuse Catherine's participation in the system, but she recognized the different forms of violence that patriarchy and slavery inflicted on all women. Though obviously not equivalently, Catherine could not stop Jonathan Westfield's violations of enslaved women. She could not refuse the arrangement without risking her own social destruction, and possibly her safety. She was a beneficiary of slavery and a participant in its cruelties, but she was also controlled by the same white male supremacy that made slavery possible. The diary also documents Dina's growing fear. By 1850, she had become aware that her knowledge made her dangerous. Jonathan Westfield knew that Dina knew everything. Several times, she overheard conversations where he discussed the problem of enslaved people who knew too much about family secrets. She recorded instances of other enslaved people on neighboring plantations who mysteriously disappeared or died after witnessing compromising situations involving their enslavers. Dina began to prepare for the possibility of her own death or sale. She entrusted copies of certain key information to other women in the network. She taught her daughter, also named Rachel, fragments of the code she used in her diary. She hid the diary itself in a location she believed would survive, behind a loose board in the cabin where she slept, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture and decay. In a diary entry from late 1850, she wrote, "If I am gone before truth can be told, let this record survive. Let someone someday know what was done here. Let the children know who they truly are. Let the mothers be remembered. This silence is a violence all its own, and I will not let it be complete. Chapter 5. The Community of Silence. The system that operated at Westfield Plantation was not an isolated aberration. It was supported by an entire community structure that benefited from maintaining silence about the sexual violence and forced reproduction that were endemic to slavery. Local doctors, lawyers, clergymen, merchants, and government officials all played roles in enabling and protecting the arrangement. Dr. Marcus Thornton, the New Orleans physician who attended Catherine Westfield, signed birth certificates he knew were false. His account books, discovered in Louisiana State Archives, show he was paid substantial fees, far more than normal obstetric care would cost, for his consulting services at Westfield Plantation. These payments were effectively hush money. Dr. Thornton's private correspondence, found among his descendants' papers, reveals that he provided similar services to at least a dozen other plantation families in the region. In one letter to a colleague in 1848, Dr. Thornton wrote casually about the peculiar domestic arrangements of plantation life, treating the systematic rape of enslaved women and the subsequent cover-ups as mundane business matters rather than crimes. His medical ethics were completely subsumed by his economic interests and his participation in white supremacist ideology. Father O'Brien, the local Catholic priest who baptized the Westfield children, accepted the family's representations without investigation. Church records show that he baptized 7 Westfield children between 1843 and 1851, listing Jonathan and Catherine as parents in each case. He never questioned why Catherine Westfield was allegedly giving birth every year or two, despite never appearing visibly pregnant and never requiring the postnatal visits that would have been customary for women who had actually given birth. Father O'Brien's correspondence with his bishop reveals that he was aware of irregularities in plantation families, but considered it inappropriate to investigate the domestic affairs of his wealthiest parishioners. His priority was maintaining the financial support that plantation families provided to the church. In one letter, he explicitly states that certain delicate matters were best left unexamined for the good of the parish. The county clerk who recorded birth certificates, a man named Samuel Foster, accepted documentation that contradicted itself, birth dates that were impossibly close together for one woman to have delivered, baptismal records that didn't match delivery dates, witnesses whose signatures appeared on dozens of suspiciously similar certificates. Foster's office was responsible for creating the official paper trail that would allow mixed-race children to be legally recognized as white, giving them access to inheritance and citizenship. Foster's personal journal, discovered in a courthouse renovation in 1987, contains revealing entries about his role. In one entry from 1845, he writes, "Recorded another Westfield birth today. The child's appearance suggests a complexity to the situation, but it is not my place to question. We all know what we know and choose not to know what we know. This is the way of things." This phrase, "choose not to know what we know," captures the essence of community complicity. These men were not fooled. They were not naive. They deliberately chose to participate in the creation and maintenance of lies, because doing so protected their own interests and the social order from which they benefited. Neighboring plantation owners operated under similar arrangements, and therefore had every reason to protect the system. The Carmichael family on the adjacent property had incorporated at least 3 children of enslaved women into their official family line. The Beauregard plantation, 10 miles downriver, had a comparable situation. At social gatherings, balls, church events, seasonal celebrations, these families would see each other's ambiguously featured children and maintain polite fictions. In correspondence between plantation mistresses discovered in various archives, there are coded references to dear family circumstances and domestic complexities that clearly refer to these arrangements. These women created a language of euphemism and implication that allowed them to acknowledge what was happening without explicitly naming it. They supported each other in maintaining the facade while privately expressing the emotional toll it took on them. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps the story of Dina and the Westfield families reach more people. The legal system was equally complicit. When enslaved women tried to resist or flee, local authorities enforced brutal recapture and punishment. When enslaved people attempted to testify about crimes committed against them, their testimony was inadmissible in court. The entire structure of law was designed to make enslavers' crimes legal and victims' resistance illegal. Court records from the parish where Westfield Plantation was located show numerous cases of enslaved women punished for insubordination or willful disobedience, charges that often masked resistance to sexual violence. In not a single case did authorities investigate or question the circumstances that might have led to such resistance. The presumption was always that enslaved people were property to be controlled, not human beings with rights to be protected. This community of silence extended even to poor whites who did not own enslaved people themselves. They benefited psychologically from the existence of slavery, which guaranteed them a position above the lowest social tier regardless of their own economic circumstances. They had every incentive to participate in the maintenance of racial fictions, even when those fictions were obviously false. The 1850 census for the parish, examined by historians in recent years, shows numerous households where racial classifications were clearly manipulated to maintain social boundaries. Children who appeared in enslaved person schedules in one census would appear in white household schedules in the next with no explanation for their reclassification. Census takers, almost always white men with ties to planter families, simply recorded what they were told to record. This was not a conspiracy in the sense of a secret plot. It was something both more pervasive and more insidious, a social consensus that the racial order must be maintained even at the cost of truth, that white supremacy was more important than honesty, and that enslaved people's humanity could be legally denied even when it was biologically undeniable. The community of silence was built on shared guilt, mutual benefit, and the understanding that exposing one family's secrets would threaten everyone's position. It was a system of mutually assured destruction that kept everyone locked in complicity. Chapter 6. Breaking Points. By 1855, 4 years after the photograph was taken, the careful structure of lies at Westfield Plantation was beginning to show cracks. The strains were both internal and external, personal and systemic. The arrangement that had seemed sustainable in the closed world of the plantation was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as children grew older and external pressures mounted. The first major crisis came with William, the eldest legitimate son. At 18, William had been sent to study at a university in Virginia, as was customary for sons of wealthy planters. There, away from the controlled environment of the plantation, he began to hear rumors about his family. Other students whose families knew the Westfields made veiled comments about the unusual composition of the family. Some expressed surprise at how many children his mother had allegedly borne in such rapid succession. William's letters home, preserved in family archives, show his growing confusion and anger. In a letter dated March 1855, he writes to his father, "I have heard things said here that trouble me greatly. I must speak with you in person about matters I cannot commit to paper. What people whisper about our family cuts me deeply." William returned to Louisiana that summer, and according to Dina's diary, there was a violent confrontation between father and son. William demanded the truth. Jonathan Westfield, according to Dina's account, admitted to the arrangement but insisted it was normal practice and that William needed to understand how plantation economies truly functioned. William reportedly left the house in rage, wrote off the property, and did not return for 3 days. When he did return, something had changed in him. He no longer participated in family gatherings the same way. He avoided his younger siblings, particularly Carolyn, Elizabeth, James, and the others he now knew were not fully his siblings. His relationship with his mother Catherine became strained. He began drinking heavily, a problem that would follow him the rest of his life. Dina recorded, "Master William knows now what was always hidden. He walks through this house like a ghost, seeing things he wished he still could not see. The truth has poisoned him, as it poisons all who must live with it." The second crisis came from within the enslaved community itself. As children of enslaved women grew into teenagers and young adults, they began to notice resemblances between themselves and the white children of the main house. Rumors circulated in the quarters. People began to whisper about which children might actually be kin to enslaved people on the plantation. In 1856, a young man named Samuel, whose mother had been sold away years earlier, confronted Dina directly and demanded to know if the rumors were true, if he had half-siblings living in the main house. Dina, according to her own diary entry, struggled with whether to tell him. She ultimately revealed that yes, he had a half-sister among the Westfield children, though she did not specify which one. Samuel's reaction was to attempt to speak directly to the children in the main house, to try to make contact with his half-sister. He was caught doing so by an overseer and was severely punished. Jonathan Westfield had him sold to a plantation in Texas within a week, separated from his remaining family and community to prevent further disruption. The brutality of this response sent a clear message to others who might have been contemplating similar confrontations. Catherine Westfield's mental state deteriorated significantly during this period. Her private journals, discovered by descendants in the 1990s, reveal a woman increasingly unable to maintain the fiction of normalcy. She wrote extensively about her nightmares, her guilt, and her inability to look at certain of the children without seeing the violence that had brought them into her home. In one particularly haunting journal entry from 1857, Catherine wrote, "I am a mother to children I did not bear and a witness to crimes I cannot name. How can I love them? How can I not? They are innocents, but their existence is a testament to sin. I pray for death sometimes, not from despair but from exhaustion. I am so very tired of pretending." Catherine began to isolate herself more completely. She stopped attending church services, stopped receiving visitors, spent long hours alone in her room. Local gossip, preserved in letters between neighboring families, speculated about her health and state of mind. Some thought she was gravely ill. Others suggested she was unstable. No one guessed the full truth of what was destroying her. The third crisis was generational. As the children born of enslaved mothers grew older, some of them began to develop features that made their mixed heritage more obvious. Skin tones that had seemed ambiguous in infancy became more clearly indicative of African ancestry in adolescence. Facial features that could be explained away in young children became harder to ignore in teenagers. Robert, born to Hannah, was particularly problematic in this regard. By age 12, his skin tone and hair texture were clearly different from his supposed full siblings. Visitors to the plantation began to comment, carefully at first, then more openly. Jonathan Westfield's response was to send Robert away to boarding school, ostensibly for education, actually to remove him from daily observation. The photograph from 1851 became a problem in itself. By 1857, it was clear that the children in that image were not aging in ways that maintained the fiction of racial uniformity. The photographic evidence of their childhood appearance contrasted with their adolescent appearance in ways that raised questions. Jonathan Westfield reportedly considered destroying the photograph but was prevented by Catherine, who insisted it remain as one of the few tangible memories of when the children were young. External pressures were also mounting. The 1850s saw increasing sectional tension over slavery. Abolitionist literature was circulating even in the South, and some of it explicitly discussed the sexual exploitation of enslaved women and the mixing of bloodlines that resulted. While plantation families publicly dismissed such accounts as Northern propaganda, privately they worried about exposure. There were also legal changes afoot. Some states were beginning to enforce more rigid definitions of racial categories, with laws that specified exactly what degree of African ancestry would result in classification as colored rather than white. These laws threatened the arrangements families like the Westfields had made. Children who had been successfully presented as white might, under stricter legal scrutiny, be reclassified with devastating social and economic consequences. By 1858, Dina recorded in her diary that Jonathan Westfield had begun meeting with lawyers to discuss options for securing the status of certain children through legal maneuvers, documents that would establish their racial classification in ways that could not be later challenged. These legal consultations were expensive and complex, involving the creation of elaborate paper trails designed to bury the truth under layers of official documentation. The breaking points were not sudden fractures but accumulating stresses that made the whole system increasingly unstable. The lies were getting harder to maintain. The children were getting older and asking questions. The enslaved community was becoming more aware and more resentful. Catherine was breaking under the psychological burden. William was alienated and angry. And Dina, watching all of this, continued to record, knowing that someday the truth would emerge no matter how many structures of silence were built to contain it. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. The beginning of the Civil War in 1861 accelerated the disintegration of the Westfield family structure. As the conflict intensified and Union forces began to advance into Confederate territory, the social order that had sustained the plantation system started to collapse. The web of lies that had held the Westfield family together for 2 decades began to unravel in ways both dramatic and gradual. In early 1862, when Union gunboats began patrolling the Mississippi River, several enslaved people from Westfield Plantation escaped by rowing out to meet the ships at night. Among them was Hannah, who was now in her late 30s. She had spent 16 years watching her son Robert grow up as a stranger, forbidden from acknowledging their relationship. When she reached Union lines, she gave testimony to military officers about conditions on the plantation. Hannah's testimony, preserved in Union Army records, includes careful descriptions of the forced breeding practices and the false family structures. She specifically named Robert as her son and described how he had been taken from her and raised as white. Union officers recorded her testimony but seemed unsure what to do with this information. The complexities of race, slavery, and family under Southern law were beyond what most Northern military personnel understood or knew how to address. As news of Hannah's escape and testimony spread back to Westfield Plantation through the complex communication networks enslaved people maintained, other mothers who had lost children to the arrangement began to hope for reunion. Ruth, whose teenage daughter had been incorporated into another planter family, began planning her own escape. Chloe, who had spent more than a decade watching her son Daniel from a distance, whispered to Dina about possibly reclaiming him when freedom came. But Jonathan Westfield was making his own plans. As Confederate authority weakened and the possibility of emancipation became real, he began destroying records. Dina witnessed him burning ledgers in his study in late 1862. She noted in her diary, "Master burns the books that tell our stories. He thinks he can burn the truth. But the truth lives in flesh and memory. The truth breathes and walks. It cannot be burned." In 1863, as Union forces moved closer to the plantation, Jonathan Westfield made a desperate decision. He gathered the children, now teenagers and young adults, and told them they would be sent away to relatives in Texas far from the war zone. But the real purpose, as Dina understood, was to separate them from potential confrontation with their biological mothers and from Union soldiers who might investigate family structures. Caroline, now 20, refused to go. According to Dina's account, Caroline had begun to suspect the truth about her origins. She had noticed the way certain enslaved women looked at her. She had noticed resemblances in the mirror that troubled her. When Jonathan insisted she leave, she demanded answers. The confrontation was explosive. Jonathan never gave her those answers directly, but his silence and rage confirmed her suspicions. Caroline locked herself in her room for 3 days. When she finally emerged, Dina recorded, she went directly to the quarters where enslaved people lived and began asking questions. She wanted to know who her mother was. It was Aunt Bess, now an elderly woman who had been part of Dina's network for decades, who finally told her. Aunt Bess led Caroline to Rachel's grave in the slave cemetery. Rachel had died in 1858, sold away from her daughter, worked to death in Mississippi fields, never having seen Caroline after infancy. Caroline's reaction was described by Dina as grief and rage in equal measure. She wept at her mother's grave for hours. She confronted Catherine Westfield and called her a liar and a thief. She confronted Jonathan Westfield and called him a rapist and a monster. The words shocked the household. No one had dared speak such truths aloud in that house before. Jonathan Westfield struck Caroline across the face and locked her in her room. But the truth once spoken could not be unspoken. Other children heard. Servants heard. The whispers spread. The Union Army reached the area in 1864. When they occupied the plantation, some of the formerly enslaved people immediately sought out the officers to tell them about the family structure and the crimes that had been committed. They wanted justice. They wanted recognition of the truth. The Army officers, however, were focused on military objectives and had neither the time nor the inclination to investigate complex domestic situations from before the war. One officer, in a report to his superior, dismissed the accounts as the usual complicated affairs of Southern plantation life and suggested that such matters were better left to civilian courts after the war. Dina, seeing that official justice would not come, took action to secure documentary justice. She retrieved her diary from its hiding place and gave it to her daughter Rachel, with instructions to preserve it and pass it down through generations. She also gave copies of key pages to several trusted women, distributing the evidence to ensure it could not be completely destroyed. As the war ended and Reconstruction began, the Westfield family faced economic collapse. The plantation could not function without enslaved labor, and Jonathan Westfield lacked both the capital and the temperament to transition to paid labor. The family fragmented. William, who had inherited after his father's death in 1866, sold much of the land and moved to New Orleans, becoming an alcoholic and dying relatively young. The children of enslaved mothers faced impossible choices. Some, like Caroline, rejected their white identity and tried to reconnect with Black family and community. Others, like Elizabeth and Sarah, chose to maintain their white identity, moved away, and tried to forget what they had learned. They married white partners, had children they raised as white, and took their secrets to their graves. Robert's case was particularly tragic. Raised as white until he was a teenager, then gradually excluded as his appearance made his mixed heritage more obvious. He existed in a kind of racial limbo during and after the war. He eventually left Louisiana entirely, moved to California, and tried to create a new identity. His descendants would not learn the truth about his background until the DNA testing of the 21st century. Dina survived until 1879, living long enough to see emancipation, but not long enough to see the truth fully acknowledged. In her final years, she lived with her daughter Rachel and grandchildren in a small house on land that had once been part of Westfield Plantation. Former enslaved people from the plantation and nearby properties would visit her, and she would tell them stories. Stories about births, about mothers and children separated, about the truth behind the lies. An interview conducted with one of Dina's grandchildren in the 1930s as part of the Federal Writers Project captured some of her final testimony. Grandma Dina used to say she brought 100 children into this world with her own hands, but the saddest births were the ones where she had to hand the baby away from its true mother to a woman who would claim it as her own. She said those babies carried two names, the name they were given, and the true name that only she remembered. She kept a book of true names, she said, hidden away for when the time was right. That book, that diary, disappeared for 140 years. It survived fires, floods, demolitions, and renovations. It survived through the protection of descendants who recognized its value even when they could not fully read it. And in 2019, when it was finally discovered and decoded, it revealed what Dina had preserved: the true names, the true stories, and the testimony of crimes that official history had tried to erase. Chapter 8. The Discovery. For more than a century, the diary remained hidden. Dina's descendants knew something existed. Family oral history spoke of a truth book that the matriarch had kept, but its location was lost through generations of displacement, death, and diaspora. The families scattered after emancipation. Land was lost. Houses burned or were demolished. Records were deliberately destroyed or accidentally lost. The Westfield Plantation itself went through multiple owners after the Civil War. The main house burned in a fire in 1889. The land was subdivided and sold off in pieces. By the mid-20th century, nothing remained of the original structures except a few crumbling slave cabins on a parcel of land that had been turned into a heritage site focused on antebellum architecture. In 2014, a historical preservation group began an archaeological survey of the site as part of a grant-funded project to document slave life in Louisiana. The team included archaeologists, historians, and community members descended from people who had been enslaved at Westfield and surrounding plantations. Among them was Dr. Lisa Monroe, a descendant of Dina through her daughter Rachel's line. Dr. Monroe had grown up hearing fragments of family stories about Dina, about her work as a midwife, about her literacy, unusual for an enslaved woman of her era, and about the Book of Truths she had supposedly kept. Dr. Monroe had become a historian partly to investigate these family legends and separate fact from myth. The archaeological team spent months excavating the sites of former slave cabins. They found artifacts that told stories of daily life: cooking implements, buttons, pieces of pottery, items that had been valued enough to keep and use but not valuable enough for enslavers to confiscate. They found evidence of the material culture enslaved people had created and maintained despite their oppression. In October 2019, while excavating a cabin foundation, a graduate student named James Parker noticed something unusual in the wall structure. There appeared to be a deliberate hollow space between boards that had been preserved by chance when the cabin partially collapsed rather than burned. Inside the space, wrapped in multiple layers of oilcloth that had protected it from moisture, was a leather-bound journal. The discovery was immediately recognized as significant. The preservation of written materials from enslaved people is extremely rare. Most enslaved people were forbidden to read or write, and those who could rarely had access to writing materials or safe storage for documents. The team carefully excavated the journal and transported it to a conservation laboratory at Louisiana State University. Initial analysis revealed the journal was from the mid-19th century, based on the paper and ink used. The handwriting was educated and clear, suggesting the author was literate, but the content was immediately puzzling. The text appeared to be in multiple languages and codes. Some passages were in English. Others used words that appeared to be from African languages. Still others used symbols and marks that didn't correspond to any known alphabet. It took nearly 3 months of careful analysis before researchers could even confirm the author's identity. A passage near the front of the journal, one of the few in plain English, read, "I am Dina, born in 1806 in Virginia, sold to Louisiana in 1822, serving as midwife to Westfield family. I write what must not be forgotten, in words that must not be read by those who would destroy this truth." The realization that this was Dina's diary, the truth book from family legend, was profound for Dr. Monroe. Her ancestor's voice, preserved across 170 years, was speaking directly to her. The emotion of that moment, captured in her published account of the discovery, brought her to tears as she read the first translated passages. Decoding the diary became a major collaborative project. Linguists specialized in African languages identified fragments of Bambara, Wolof, and other West African languages that Dina had apparently learned from her mother and other enslaved people. Cryptographers worked on the symbol systems Dina had invented to disguise sensitive information. Historians provided context for the dates, names, and events mentioned. The first fully decoded passages dealt with births, dates, times, circumstances, the names of mothers and children. As the translation progressed, the true significance of what Dina had recorded became clear. She had documented the secret history of the Westfield family, including explicit details about which children were born to enslaved mothers and which to Catherine Westfield. One of the most powerful sections, decoded in early 2020, read, "January 14, 1843, delivered Caroline to Rachel. Rachel, age 17, forced by master for 6 months prior. Labor lasted 9 hours. Child light-skinned, may pass. Rachel weeping would not release child. I had to take the baby from her arms by force. Mistress Catherine took child, went to her room. Rachel sent to Fields next day. This is the 7th child I have delivered into lies." The diary contained similar entries for Elizabeth, James, Robert, Sarah, Daniel, and Emily, each entry documenting the biological mother, the circumstances of conception, invariably described as forced or coerced, the details of birth, and the immediate aftermath when children were separated from their mothers. But Dina had recorded more than just births. She had documented the psychological toll on everyone involved. She noted Catherine Westfield's deteriorating mental health. She recorded conversations she overheard between Jonathan and Catherine about the arrangement. She documented the complicity of doctors, priests, and officials. She named names and described crimes with devastating clarity. The diary also contained deeply personal reflections. Dina wrote about her own grief and moral anguish at being forced to participate in the system. She wrote about the network of women who supported each other. She wrote about resistance, small acts of defiance, moments of truth-telling, plans for preservation of knowledge. She wrote prayers in multiple languages, expressions of faith that sustained her through horror. As news of the discovery spread, descendants of the Westfield family, both white and black, began to come forward. The 2019 photograph of the 12 people had survived in multiple family lines, passed down as an heirloom. Now, with Dina's diary decoded, descendants could finally understand what they were looking at. DNA testing confirmed what Dina had recorded. Descendants of Caroline matched with descendants of enslaved people who had lived at Westfield Plantation. Descendants of Robert matched with descendants of Hannah's line. Piece by piece, the biological truth validated the documentary truth of the diary. The revelation was traumatic for many white descendants who had believed they came from purely European ancestry. It was validating but painful for black descendants who had carried oral histories that family historians had dismissed as unreliable. It forced both groups to confront the violence and lies at the foundation of their family histories. Some white descendants refused to accept the findings, insisting the diary must be fraudulent or the DNA test flawed. Others embraced the truth and began the difficult work of acknowledging their family's crimes and connecting with black relatives they had never known existed. The range of responses revealed how deeply the wounds of slavery continue to affect descendants generations later. Dr. Monroe led the effort to publish Dina's diary with full historical context and family tree analysis. The book, published in 2023, became both an academic milestone and a bestseller. It sparked national conversations about slavery's sexual violence, about the construction of racial categories, about family secrets and historical memory. The most profound impact, however, was on the families themselves. Cousins who had never known of each other's existence met for the first time. Family reunions brought together white and black branches of the same family tree. Shared grief and shared history created new bonds across racial lines that slavery had tried to make permanent. Chapter 9. Legacy and Truth. The story of Dina's diary and the Westfield family photograph extends far beyond one plantation in Louisiana. It represents a pattern that was repeated across the American South and throughout slaveholding societies. A systematic use of sexual violence, forced reproduction, and falsified family records to maintain racial hierarchies, while simultaneously undermining the very categories those hierarchies claim to protect. Modern genetic studies estimate that up to 30% of white-identified Americans with Southern ancestry have detectable African DNA, much of it resulting from the systematic rape of enslaved women by enslavers and overseers. Every one of those percentages represents stories like the ones Dina documented. Women violated, children separated, truths buried, families constructed on foundations of violence and lies. The photograph from 1851, now on display at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, has become an iconic image for confronting these hidden histories. Visitors stand before it and see not just a plantation family frozen in time, but a visual representation of the lies that structured American society for centuries. Educational programs built around Dina's diary and the Westfield story have helped tens of thousands of students and adults understand the personal dimension of slavery's violence. The diary makes abstract historical categories concrete. It shows real women with names, real children who grew up not knowing their mothers, real families destroyed by a system that treated human beings as property and women's bodies as sites of profit and pleasure for enslavers. The legal implications of the discovery were complex. Some descendants considered filing lawsuits seeking recognition of property rights or inheritance that would have been due to the biological children of Jonathan Westfield if their parentage had been accurately recorded. Ultimately, these legal avenues proved impractical. Too much time had passed, too many legal structures had changed, and proving material damages from crimes committed 170 years ago was nearly impossible. But there were other forms of justice pursued. In 2024, the Louisiana State Legislature passed a resolution formally acknowledging the systematic sexual violence against enslaved women and the falsification of family records that occurred throughout the state during slavery. The resolution specifically named Dina as an example of women who resisted erasure by documenting truth. The state also committed funds to support DNA testing and genealogical research for descendants of enslaved people seeking to reconstruct their family histories. Several descendants of enslaved women from Westfield Plantation, working with the Historical Preservation Organization, created a memorial on the site where the plantation once stood. The memorial lists the names of all known enslaved people who lived at Westfield, including the mothers whose children were stolen: Rachel, Mary, Hannah, Esther, Chloe, and Judith. It includes quotations from Dina's diary, testimony in her own words about what she witnessed and what she preserved. Caroline's story had a particular resonance for many who learned about it. After discovering the truth about her mother Rachel in 1863, Caroline had devoted her remaining years to working with formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction. She had used her literacy and her connections to help document families separated by slavery. She had testified in several legal cases about the sexual violence she herself had been a product of, risking her social position to speak truth. Caroline died in 1892, having never married or had children. Her final will, discovered in parish records, left her modest estate to a school for black children and included a statement: "I was born from violence and raised in lies. Let my legacy be the truth and education, which are the only remedies for the sins of the past." The descendants of William, Margaret, and Thomas, the three children who were undisputedly Catherine's biological children, faced their own reckoning. They had inherited privilege based partly on lies about their siblings. Some of their descendants chose to use that historical privilege to support reparative efforts, contributing money and land to community organizations serving descendants of enslaved people. For black descendants, the discovery of the diary and the confirmation of family connections was both painful and empowering. It validated oral histories that had been dismissed by historians and white family members. It proved that the memories passed down through generations, whispered stories about stolen children and hidden kinship, were not myth or exaggeration, but suppressed truth. Family reunions held in 2024 and 2025 brought together hundreds of descendants from both sides of the color line. These gatherings were not simple celebrations. They required difficult conversations about the inheritance of trauma, about the ongoing effects of slavery, about responsibility and repair, but they also created space for recognition of shared humanity and shared history that had been denied for generations. Dr. Lisa Monroe, reflecting on her work decoding her ancestors' diary, wrote, "Dina preserved truth when truth was dangerous. She documented crimes when documentation meant death if discovered. She maintained her humanity and ethical clarity in a system designed to destroy both. She is my hero not because she was superhuman, but because she was fully human in circumstances that tried to reduce her to property. Her legacy is the simple, revolutionary act of insisting that truth matters, that memory matters, that our lives and stories matter." The diary continues to be studied by scholars. New insights emerge as more contextual research is completed. Comparisons with other rare documents from enslaved people reveal patterns of resistance and documentation. The sophisticated coding system Dina developed has been analyzed as an example of literacy practices under oppression. Several documentaries and scholarly books have been produced about the Westfield story. A feature film is in development, though creators are grappling with how to tell such a painful story without exploiting the trauma or simplifying the complex moral landscape. Descendants are consulted throughout the creative process, ensuring that any artistic representation honors the truth Dina fought to preserve. Subscribe to this channel to learn more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of Dina and Westfield Plantation. See you in the next video. The photograph from 1851 remains a starting point for understanding how slavery operated, not just as an economic system, but as a structure of violence that destroyed families, falsified identities, and created wounds that persist across generations. The 12 people in that image lived lives shaped by that violence, some as perpetrators, some as victims, some as both, all trapped in a system larger than any individual. Dina's legacy is preserved in her diary, in her descendants, and in the truth she refused to let die. Her voice, speaking across 170 years, reminds us that silence is complicity, that documentation is resistance, and that confronting painful truths is the only path to healing. The crimes of slavery cannot be undone, the families destroyed cannot be restored, but the truth can be honored, the victims can be named, and the demand for justice, however belated, can still be spoken. The midwife knew which children were the masters. She knew all the secrets the photograph concealed, and she made sure that someday someone would know them too.